Okay, get ready to dive into a workplace safety case with some serious implications, because you sent us a real head-scratcher here.
Oh, yeah.
A situation with Bio Dynamic UK Limited, 2 workers injured, the HSE steps in, and bam, prosecution.
Sounds intriguing.
You want to understand what went wrong, the legal basis behind the HSE's actions, and whether taking biodynamic to court was even the right call.
Yeah, a bit of a legal puzzle, it seems, isn't it?
Right.
What we have here. You've given us excerpts from some pretty key UK legislation, like the environmental permitting regulations,
All right.
the Health and Safety at Work Act, and the Fire Safety Order, all laying out the ground rules, right? But as with any good mystery, we need to put the pieces together.
We've got to figure out the who, the what, and the why of all this.
Biodynamics actions, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. It's like, we've got these puzzle pieces, but we don't have the box.
Right.
Like, we're missing those critical details about the accident itself. We don't even really know what industry biodynamic is in.
That's true. But you know what? These regulations give us some clues.
Okay.
The fact that they deal with things like controlling explosive atmospheres, managing dangerous substances, and fire safety requirements, it all suggests that biodynamic might be operating in a pretty high-risk environment.
Interesting.
This isn't some average office setting we're talking about.
Not at all. So we're in the UK. We know that biodynamic could be involved in anything from, like, waste management to chemical processing to manufacturing.
Right.
I mean, who knows? This could be the next big thing in rocket fuel.
The possibilities are kind of endless.
Yeah, a little unnerving, but endless.
A little bit unnerving for sure, but yeah, true. I think it's important, though, to focus on what we do know.
Okay, good point.
Regardless of what they do, like any company, Biodynamic has a fundamental legal obligation to ensure a safe working environment for their employees.
That's where the Health and Safety Work Act comes in play, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Like, that's the bedrock, right?
Sure. It's the basis of workplace safety law in the UK. You've got it. This act, passed back in 1974, really just lays it all out there, you know? It states that employers have a duty to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of their workers.
Okay.
So far as reasonably practicable?
See, now that phrase always gets me. Reasonably practicable.
Right.
Like, what does that actually mean, you know?
What does it mean in practice? It's not like companies need to, like, wrap their employees in bubble wrap 2004/7.
Right, exactly.
That's a great question, and it's the source of a lot of debate. But reasonably practicable essentially means that employers need to take precautions that are feasible
Okay.
and sensible considering the nature of the work,
Okay.
the level of risk involved, the cost and practicality of implementing safety measures.
That's kind of a balancing act, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you're running a nuclear power plant, the reasonably practicable standard is way higher than, say, like a bookstore.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. The law recognizes that those risks vary across industries and tasks. So yeah, it wouldn't be reasonable to expect a small shop to have the same safety protocols as a major construction site.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But even in a seemingly low-risk place like a bookstore, there are still reasonable precautions.
Of course, yeah.
Making sure there's proper lighting, you know, secure shelving to prevent accidents, things like that.
Right. So I see the nuances here. Reasonably practicable isn't about eliminating every single possible risk.
No.
It's about taking steps to minimize the risks, but in a way that's effective but also reasonable.
Exactly. That's what it's all about. And that's where these environmental permitting regulations come in.
Okay.
It adds another layer.
Okay.
These regulations get into the nitty-gritty of specific activities, especially ones that could impact the environment.
Right.
And by extension, worker safety.
So these regulations are really laser focused, right, on managing waste, controlling pollution, making sure everything's operating within those very strict limits. They're like, I don't know, the instruction manual for industries dealing with the messy side of things.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
Right.
It's important to remember that violations of these regulations can have some pretty serious consequences. And we're not talking about a slap on the wrist here. These can lead to enforcement action by the HSE.
Which brings us to that fire safety order, right?
Yes.
That third piece of the puzzle here.
It's a big one.
Yeah. This one's particularly interesting because it focuses on preventing fires and making sure everyone can get out safely in case of emergency. Could this be a clue about the nature of the accident at Biodynamic?
It's certainly possible. It's definitely something to keep in mind as we try to piece together the events that led to the HSE's decision to prosecute.
Right.
It's key to remember these regulations don't exist in isolation.
Yeah.
They overlap, they intertwine. It's like this web of legal obligations that companies like Bio Dynamic have to navigate.
Totally. So we've got a company potentially operating in a high-risk environment.
Right.
We know 2 workers were injured. We've got this arsenal of regulations that the HSE can use to hold them accountable. The plot is thickening.
It is.
But before we jump to conclusions, let's talk about the HSE itself for a second.
Okay.
Like, who are these guys?
Yeah.
What's their role in all of this?
Well, the HSE, they're not just any regular regulatory body.
Right.
They are the UK's national watchdog when it comes to workplace health and safety.
So they're kind of like the safety police, but hopefully with a less intimidating uniform.
Yeah, something like that. More like safety advisors. But they do have some serious legal clout.
Okay.
And it's important to remember, they don't take that enforcement action lightly.
Mm-hmm.
They have a range of options they can use. Everything from issuing those improvement notices to imposing some pretty hefty fines, and sometimes even going for criminal prosecution.
And that's what happened here with Bio Dynamic.
They did, yeah.
They went for that nuclear option, prosecution.
It's a big one, isn't it?
But why? I mean, what could have pushed them to take such a drastic step?
That's the big question, isn't it? That's the million-dollar question. It's at the heart of what we're looking at today. Totally. To answer that, we need to understand the HSE's decision-making process.
Yeah.
Like, what are the factors they're considering?
Right.
And what are the potential consequences of their actions, both for Bio Dynamic and the wider industry? So shall we go a little deeper?
Absolutely. Let's uncover the whys, the hows of the HSE's actions, and see if we can shed a little light on this very complex case.
Let's do it.
So we've got our stage set. We've got what looks like a high-risk environment, an accident, and this powerful regulatory body with some serious tools at its disposal.
Right.
But let's figure out why the HSE chose prosecution, that most serious option they have.
It's really important to remember prosecution is not their go-to.
Right.
For less serious violations, they might just issue an improvement notice, giving the company time to rectify the issue, or a prohibition notice, basically telling them to stop until they've addressed the risk. They even have those fixed penalty notices for certain breaches, kind of a pay-and-learn system.
So those are kind of like warnings, like a chance for companies to get their act together before things get really serious. But with Bio Dynamic, they just went straight to court. That seems to suggest they saw something really bad, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it does imply they found something pretty egregious in this case.
Yeah.
The decision to prosecute is really selective,
Okay.
It's based on a whole lot of factors.
Right.
The HSE would definitely be considering things like how badly those workers were hurt,
Right.
the potential for future harm if those violations were just allowed to keep going, and even Bio Dynamic's past compliance record.
So like a judge handing down a sentence.
Yeah, kind of.
They're not just looking at the current offense, but the company's history as well. Like a first-time offender might get off a little easier, but a repeat offender, they're probably facing the full force of the law.
Exactly. It's a very good analogy. Don't forget about that whole deterrent effect either.
Right.
I mean, the HSE wants to send a message to other companies. Don't mess with worker safety or you could be next.
It's like one of those scary public service announcements you see on TV.
Right.
They show you like a horrible car crash. Not exactly subtle,
Right.
but you definitely pay attention. Okay, so let's try to think like the HSE for a minute.
Okay.
What about this specific case would made them choose prosecution?
Well, this is where those regulations we talked about before come in again.
Okay, yeah.
Remember that reasonably practicable idea. The HSE probably had to find evidence that Bio Dynamic just wasn't meeting that standard.
Okay.
So maybe they didn't assess the risks in their workplace properly,
Huh.
or didn't give their workers the right safety gear or training, maybe even ignored warnings they'd gotten about hazards.
So it's not just about like checking off boxes on a list, right?
No, not at all.
It's showing that what Bio Dynamic did or didn't do directly led to that accident.
Yes, exactly. Causation is key.
Yeah.
They've got to demonstrate that link between those alleged breaches of regulations and the injuries the workers suffered.
They'd have to convince a court that Bio Dynamic's negligence was a direct cause of the accident.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we're building a case here. We've got potential violations, evidence of negligence, 2 injured workers, but let's not forget Bio Dynamic's side of the story.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, They might have argued that they did take the right safety measures, that this was just a terrible accident?
Of course, that's right. Every case has two sides, and they would have definitely had a chance to defend themselves.
Right.
They might argue that they followed all the rules, did all the risk assessments, gave their employees the right training and equipment. They did everything by the book.
So it basically becomes a battle of evidence and, like, legal interpretation then.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, whose version of events is more believable?
Right.
Whose actions or inactions were actually reasonable?
That's what they have to decide.
So lots of courtroom drama. The HSE presents its case. Biodynamic counters. A judge decides if Biodynamic's guilty of those violations.
Exactly, right.
Talk about pressure.
High stakes.
Yeah, big time. Okay, let's switch gears for a second and go back to those regulations for a minute. We talked about the Health and Safety at Work Act being like the foundation of UK workplace safety law.
The cornerstone, yes.
Yeah. So how do those other regulations, the environmental permitting regulations and the fire safety order, how do those fit in?
Well, they add those specifics, those really detailed rules that kind of flesh out the main principles of the Health and Safety at Work Act.
Okay.
Think of them as the individual chapters in that big safety playbook.
Like different sections in a driver's manual.
Yes, exactly. Each one's focusing on a different aspect of how to operate safely.
Right.
So those environmental permitting regulations, like we said before, they dive into all the intricacies of managing waste, controlling pollution, and operating within those limits for those potentially dangerous activities.
Right. So, for example, if Biodynamic were handling dangerous chemicals or operating a waste incinerator, these regulations would basically tell them exactly what they need to do.
They would, yeah. And any violations of these rules can have huge consequences. I mean, the HSE could come down hard with fines. They could revoke operating permits. They could even shut down operations completely.
Okay, that's a pretty big motivator to stay on the right side of the law then.
Right.
What about the fire safety order? How does that one work?
That one is all about fire prevention.
Okay.
And making sure people can evacuate safely if there is a fire. It covers almost every workplace you can think of.
Right.
And it includes a ton of different requirements, like doing those regular fire risk assessments, making sure all the safety equipment is installed and maintained, things like alarms and extinguishers, stuff like that.
So if Biodynamic's accident did involve, say, a fire or explosion, the HSE would have been looking very closely at whether they were following the fire safety order.
Yes.
Like, were their fire risk assessments actually adequate?
Right.
Did they have the right equipment, the right evacuation procedures?
Exactly, yeah. So each one of these sets of regulations basically gives a framework for looking at what Biodynamic did and figuring out if they took those reasonably practicable steps to make sure things were safe. But it's not just about what's actually written in the law,
Right.
There's another layer that the HSE uses, and that's called statutory and non-statutory guidance.
Okay, hold on. New terms here.
Yeah.
What's the difference between those? And why are they important in this case?
Well, think of statutory guidance as the official playbook.
Okay.
It comes straight from the government. It explains how those regulations should actually be used in practice. It's like a super detailed manual to help companies understand their legal obligations.
Yeah.
And it gives them best practices for actually complying.
So like cheat codes for all those complex regulations.
Kind of, yeah. It gives you specific examples, explains key terms, offers advice, all that.
Okay.
And companies are expected to follow it really closely.
Makes sense.
Because if they don't, it can be used against them in court. And then there's the non-statutory guidance.
Okay, what's that?
Think of that as like the unofficial tips and tricks you get from people who've been doing this a long time. It comes from, industry groups, professional bodies, even the HSE themselves.
Right.
It's not legally binding.
Okay.
But it does represent that general agreement on what the best practices are. And it can be really influential in shaping how companies manage safety.
So it's kind of like the combined wisdom of the whole industry saying, hey, this is how we do things to stay safe and avoid getting in trouble.
Exactly. You've got it. And here's where things get really interesting for the Biodynamic case.
Okay.
Because the HSE would have looked at both types of guidance when they were investigating the accident.
Right.
So did Biodynamic actually follow the official playbook? Did they stick to those industry best practices? If not, that could have been a big reason why they decided to prosecute.
Okay, so it's not just about technically breaking the law. It's about following that spirit of good safety practice.
That's right.
As defined by, both the government and the industry itself.
Yes, and that's what makes this case so fascinating, really.
Yeah.
It reminds us that workplace safety isn't just about ticking boxes on a checklist, it's about creating a culture of safety.
Right.
Going above and beyond the bare minimum, always trying to protect workers and stop harm before it happens.
So biodynamic might have technically followed the regulations, but they might have still fallen short of those best practices set out in the guidance, which is like a subtle difference, but an important one. But still, the question is, was prosecution really the right call?
Yeah, that's the real question, isn't it? It's a tough one to answer. To really get to the bottom of it, we need to look at the other options they had.
Right.
We need to think about what might have happened if they'd done something different, and then consider the impact of their decision, the ripple effects. So I think we need to explore those different enforcement options that the HSE had.
Yeah, totally. Let's see what those alternative routes were and try to reach a verdict on whether prosecution was really the best way to go in this situation. So we've spent all this time unpacking this biodynamic case,
We have.
the incidents, the regulations, the HSE's choice to go for prosecution. But just like in a good courtroom drama, there's always more to uncover. We've kind of explored the what and the how. But now, don't you think we need to really grapple with the why?
The why indeed.
Was prosecution really the best course of action here?
That is the million-dollar question, and it takes us out of that black and white, the legal violations and into those gray areas. What were the consequences? Did it really deter others? And ultimately, did it achieve what the HSE is really aiming for, which is to prevent this kind of harm from happening again?
So it's not just about punishing biodynamic. It's about setting an example,
Yeah.
right? Making sure this doesn't happen somewhere else.
Exactly. Think about it. If they just gave him a slap on the wrist, a small fine, a warning, would that have really hit home? Would Biodynamic have really changed their approach to safety? Would other companies in similar industries have even noticed?
Yeah, those are some pretty big questions. And I guess you could see how the HSE might have felt like prosecution was the only way to really make a difference, to create some real change.
Yeah.
But let's look at it from a different perspective.
Okay.
Some people would argue that prosecution, by its very nature, is reactive. It only happens after something bad has already happened, right? Wouldn't it be better to focus on preventing these accidents in the first place?
That's a very valid point, and it highlights a real tension when it comes to workplace safety, doesn't it? Ideally, of course, we want to stop accidents from happening at all.
Of course, yeah.
But the fact is they do happen. And when they do, especially when people get hurt, someone has to be accountable.
So it's this balance, right, between holding companies responsible and trying to encourage them to be proactive about safety. But how do you find that balance?
That's the tricky part. And there's no easy answer. The HSE gets this, and they use a few different approaches.
Yeah.
Yes, they have those enforcement powers, but they also do a lot of education. They provide guidance. They work with different industries to try and promote best practices, and to try and get ahead of the problem.
So it's not just about punishment, it's about giving them the tools to do things right from the beginning.
Yeah, that's part of it too. But let's get back to the biodynamic case. Even if we accept that reacting after the fact isn't ideal, we still need to decide if prosecution was the right response in this particular situation.
Okay, yeah, good point. We've established that the HSE had options. Improvement notices, prohibition notices, even those fixed penalties. So why did they go straight for the most serious option?
Well, it probably came down to what was happening in this specific case. We know 2 workers were injured. That suggests this wasn't a minor incident, but they would have been looking at a lot more than that. How serious were the safety breaches? What was Biodynamic's track record like? Could this have happened again? And what kind of message would it send to other companies?
It's like that detective we were talking about before, piecing everything together.
Yeah.
The evidence, the motives, what the consequences might be, and then they make a decision. But in this case, we're missing a piece of that puzzle, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
What happened with the prosecution? Did the HSE prove their case?
Right.
Was Biodynamic found guilty? And what were the penalties?
Without that information, it's hard to say for sure. But we can think about what might have happened
Okay.
if Biodynamic was found guilty.
Yeah.
The penalties could be anything from really big fines to, in the most serious case, even prison time for the people who were in charge.
Yeah, that's serious.
Yeah.
But even beyond legal penalties, there's that damage to their reputation.
Oh, for sure.
People might not trust them anymore,
Right. They lose public trust.
and that could affect their whole business.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the people who were actually hurt.
Yeah, that's the most important part.
those workers. They might have long-term health problems, they might not be able to work, and it takes an emotional toll, too. That's the real cost of these safety failures. It goes way beyond what happens in court.
It really puts it all into perspective. These aren't just abstract legal issues. Real people are affected by these decisions. But even without knowing what ultimately happened with biodynamic, I think there's a lot we can learn from this.
Definitely. It really shows how important those regulations and guidelines are and how they play out in real life. It reminds us that every company has to make safety a priority, not just to avoid legal problems, but to look after their workers.
And it reminds us that we all have a part to play, whether you're an employee, a manager, or just someone who wants to see a safer world. We need to understand these issues, speak up if we see something risky, and really push for a culture where prevention is key.
Knowledge is power.
Right.
And when it comes to workplace safety, that knowledge can actually save lives. So if this has got you thinking, I really encourage you to learn more. The HSE website is a great resource. Tons of information, guidance, case studies, and there's a lot out there from industry groups, safety organizations, legal experts, all sorts.
It's like we always say, the learning doesn't stop when we're done here. This was just a glimpse into this whole world of workplace safety. So keep those questions coming. Keep learning. And let's all work towards a world where everyone is safe at work.